stand together, not about what we're against, but about what we're for, about who we're for. And kept working at it, building on our coalitions, and before you knew it, at the end of last year, we passed the first time in decades, the first bill that starts to tear down the evil of mass incarceration in our country. And guess what? The last provision I got in that bill was the first ever federal ban on putting children in solitary confinement. Don't tell me what we can't do. And when I say we, I'm not talking about people with titles. And yeah, I'm excited about electing people. It's a key to our democracy. But as we talk about presidential races, here we are in Nashville that showed 27 for 27 that we can build a party from the grassroots up. Because that's where power comes from. And I want to remind you, this is the story of my life. It's the story of everybody in this room. Look around this room. It's rooms like this that changed my destiny. Not who the president was, not who senators were. It was rooms like this When my family wanted to find a great community in New Jersey with great public schools to move into, they found out in 1969 that those neighborhoods, which tended to be white, when they would show up to buy a home, the real estate agent would see the color of their skin and say to them, "Oh, I'm sorry, this house has been pulled off the market." Or, "Oh, I'm sorry, this house has already been sold." And my parents were frustrated, and they looked around for help, and they found help. My people used to meet in living rooms like this, not this crowded, but they meant living rooms. And they said to my parents, "We will help you, because this nation believes in values, but we haven't achieved them yet, but we are going to bend the arc of history towards justice ourselves." And they got to working with my parents. A group of lawyers started volunteering, and they set up a sting operation. My parents would go look at a house. They would be told it was sold. A volunteer white couple would come right behind them and find out the house was still for sale. On the house that I would grow up in, my parents loved it. They were told it was already sold. The white couple came behind them, found out the house was still for sale. They put a bid on the house. The bid was accepted. Papers were drawn up. A closing was set. But the white couple did not show up for the closing. My father did. And a volunteer lawyer. And I imagine, my dad and family used to imagine that this lawyer must have practiced his speech all night. He walked in probably ready to say, "You're in violation of federal housing law. You're in violation of the values of our nation." But instead, as soon as he revealed that this real estate agent had been caught in a sting operation, the real estate agent didn't give up. He stands up and punches my dad's lawyer in the face. And then he sigs a dog on my dad. And let me tell you something. As I was growing up, every time my dad would tell that story, the dog would get bigger. When I was older, 18 years old, I'm eating my Cheerios, and my dad would come over and say, "Boy, you better appreciate what you had. I had to fight a pack of wolves to get you in this house." And hate, Catholic hate, to Jim Crow, the country who has shown that you can go from sweatshops and child labor to public education and workers' rights. This nation has shown we can deal with difficult problems, but the test of our country right now is, can we put more indivisible back in this one nation under God? Can we repair the torn fabric of our nation? Can we reach out to our brothers and sisters who might be different than us or live in different places, but say that we have one American destiny? Those farmers who are facing suicide rates that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, those farmers who are getting less of the consumer dollar than they did, just the least amount that they have in decades, who are facing corporate consolidation, if you don't think that their destiny is interwoven with families in my community, in the inner city of Newark, in my neighborhood bodega, where people are using food expensive than a Twinkie, if you don't think that we're all wrapped up in a broken food system, that we all share a common purpose in healing it, then we're giving in to the delusion, the dangerous delusion Democrats our ability to beat Republicans. The test of this next election is our ability to unite Americans, to remind people about this common purpose. Our challenge is, can we as a people revive civic grace, engender a more courageous empathy? Can we show, like our ancestors did, that self-reliance and rugged individualism are great American sentiments, but self-reliance didn't get us to the moon. Rugged individualism didn't help pull people together to get an underground railroad bringing people from slavery to freedom. And so let me end with this. I want to end by talking about your power. Do not believe any presidential candidate that's going to say, hey, I got all the answers and all the solutions. Definitely don't believe a president that says, only I can solve these problems. It is we. It has always been we. Never me. We have power, but what I worry now is not about the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, as King would say. It's the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. The most common way people give up their power is not realizing they have it in the first place, and I want to end with a story to remind folks how powerful they are, to reflect on what I'm going to be talking about this whole campaign. And this is the second half of that story, because when I got to Washington, I decided to write a book. It might not surprise you that the title of the book is United. The mission I've seen from the time I started as a civic councilman, uniting people in the fight against injustice. And so I had to go back. If you have a daddy like mine, you're going to write a book, you got to fact check everything. I mean, God, was it a pack of wolves or just a dog? And so I go back and start interviewing people. I go to try to find the head of the Fair Housing Council from the 1960s. She was easy to find because she is 92 years old, Miss Lee Porter, who is still the head of the Fair Housing Council in Northern Jersey. And this 92-year-old woman with her hand still on the plow, African-American woman, I asked her, well, who do you represent now in the Fair Housing Council? Black families? She goes, no. Now the families I have to fight for are same-sex couples, Americans with disabilities, Muslim families. And she still fights because she knows that justice has no color, has no religion, has no orientation. There is one cause of our country, and that's to make American justice real for everyone. And I tell you, I amazingly ask her, where about these lawyers? And she sends me to the lawyer who organized all of this. And this is the thing that knocked me over that I want to leave you with, because I found this guy who organized all the other lawyers. His name is Arthur Lessman, 84 years old. And I say, Arthur, hello, sir, my name is Corey. I know who you are. All right, sir, well, do you know what you did for I know what I did for your family. And he confirms all of the facts of the story for me. It was not a pack of wolves. But the end, this is what he knocked me over with that I want to leave you with before we get to some Q&A. And literally, I was stunned by this story. I finally, after listening to him and the details of his life, he was just starting out with a law firm. He had bills to pay. He had a family to take care of. Why would he take time out to help black families move into his neighborhood at a time of fear and demagoguery and white flight and property values going down? I said to him, why would you stand up and represent black families as busy as you were? And he goes, Corey, I remember the moment I made the decision. And I said, the moment? You remember the moment? He goes, yeah, I was sitting down watching TV. Now, I do this all the time. At night, I come home, I hang out in a watch TV. I'm sitting on the couch and I'm watching Rachel. And it's getting me all upset. And I'm like, somebody should do something about this. And then I realize, you're a United States Senator. To start a business, sitting down on his couch watching TV one Sunday night. And I know the movie he was watching. This was back when we had 3 channels, y'all. Some of you remember this. Tell your children about it. Remind them how hard it was back then. We had 3 channels. What happened at 11 o'clock? National anthem, it'd be over. No more TV. That's why we had higher birth rates back then. Okay. And he's watching TV. Most of America was watching this movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. And they broke away from the movie. It was breaking news. Not like today, we have it every 15 seconds. Melania has a jacket. Breaking news. This was rare. And he's watching TV and he's stunned that they break away from a movie to show a bridge in Alabama called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You see, these marchers had started in Selma, and they were marching to Montgomery to protest what? Voting rights. But they get stopped on this bridge, confronted by Alabama state troopers, and he says he's watching this in horror from his seat as these marchers decided they couldn't go forward. They were going to kneel and pray. That was their intention. I know that because one of those men on the bridge is now my colleague, still my hero. His name is John Lewis. And Congressman Lewis told me they were going to kneel and pray and then turn around. But just as they start to kneel, they were gassed. Tear gas shot at them. Panic sets in. People are running, but the state troopers then charge in, wielding billy clubs, viciously beating the marchers. John Lewis said to me humbly, this regal man with humility, he says to me, Corey, I shed a little bit of blood on that bridge that day. And I'm like, Congressman Lewis, you had your head busted open. You were knocked unconscious. You bled profusely. And what does this man do on a couch in New Jersey who's watching this? What does this white man do 1,000 miles away? Does he get caught and stuck in a state of sedentary agitation? No. Does he allow his inability to do everything to undermine his determination to do something? No. He gets up off of that couch and says, you know what? I may not be able to change the world, but I'm going to make a world of change somewhere. I know if it is to be, it is up to me. I know that I must do the best I can where I am with what I have. And he gets on the phone and he starts calling around who might need a little bit of legal pro bono work to deal with the cause of civil rights in America. And he finds this woman named Miss Lee Porter who's like, hallelujah, thank you, I need some help. And they go to work. That was 1965. 4 years later, he says he gets his case file with two names on it that says Carrie and Carolyn Booker, my parents. Think about this power right now. Some marchers on a bridge stand up for righteousness, stand up for our nation, stand up for the true definition of patriotism. Patriotism is love of country, and you cannot love your country if you don't love your fellow countrymen and women. God, where have we come in America where people say the highest aspiration for our nation is to be a tolerant nation? Come on. Go home tonight and tell somebody that you live with that you tolerate them and see if that's a high compliment. Our nation was not formed to be a nation of tolerance. We knew we had to have an unusual commitment to each other because we don't have the bonds of race. We don't have the bonds of religion. We don't have the bonds of tribalism. But those imperfect geniuses wrote into the Declaration of Independence that declaration of interdependence. They said if we're going to make it all work, if we are going to be a free country, a just country, a fair country, a country that every generation is better than the one before, we must mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Love says, I recognize you, I see you, I know that our lives are interwoven and we share a destiny. Love says that if your children don't get a great public education, if your children don't have access to health care, my children are the less for it. Tolerance crosses streets. Love sees and embraces. Tolerance builds walls. Love tears them down. Tolerance says, I couldn't care less. Love says, I couldn't care more. Because we are one people, one nation under God with one destiny. And so here are these marchers on a bridge in the name of patriotism, in the name of a beloved community. Stand up and release that energy that leaps 1,000 miles instantaneously and changes the heart of one man on a couch in Jersey, who then gets up and goes on to change the destiny of a generation not yet born. I tell you this on this President's Day, I would not be standing here running for President of the United States of America, if it wasn't for that chain reaction of love, if it wasn't for ordinary Americans standing up for the extraordinary cause of our nation, committing to each other and unleashing that energy, that is who we are. We are at a crossroads in our country. It's not just about policy ideas. It's not just about the legislation. It is about the capacity to get things done, to help people, to heal folks, to educate folks, to care for folks, to elevate this nation. I tell you right now, in conclusion, that we are a country that has every potential to heal people, to provide health care, to provide education. But the only way we can do that is if we do it together. And if we work together and stand together and sacrifice together, our tomorrows will be better than our yesterdays. We will make justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. If we live like that and love like that, I promise you in this election, we can start to set our course on a country that ensures that we as a nation will rise. Thank you, everybody. All right. We already have some hands up. Why? Because this is New Hampshire. And people are like, okay, that's a good speech, Corey. Let's get going. I'm going to go to the young man in plaid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
School shootings as we know it.
So the urgency is school shootings. The urgency is school shootings in churches and synagogues and nightclubs. The urgency is shootings in communities like the one I live in, where Shahad Smith last year was shot at the top of my block, where every day in America we see dozens of people killed and murdered. And the urgency is right, because people feel fear. And so in order to deal with that, we need to do the things we all already agree on. You know this. 86% of NRA members, over 90% of Americans believe that we should have common sense, universal background checks. Steps like this would actually shrink or constrict the flow of these weapons onto our streets and our communities. We need to close the loopholes that exist. Loopholes that don't exist for spousal couples, but a boyfriend who's stalking their girlfriend can find a loophole to still get access to a weapon. We need to end loopholes like they have in the NICS system that you know about. That if you don't get a NICS return back in a timely period, you can just get a gun. Even though most of 90% of NICS checks are instantaneous, for those that are not, people can find loopholes. We need to close all of the common sense loopholes, do the things that overwhelming majority of Americans do to make ourselves safer. And then after that, I'd like to try to do some even more things, like banning assault rifles and weapons that don't belong in the streets of America. And I'm going to tell you, what's going to change that, if we just wait for Congress to do it, or even the next president to do it, that's not enough. What's going to do it is what you're doing, which is organizing folks, regardless of political party, regardless of political affiliation. All millennials and Generation Z like you believe that we should make these changes. And change, as I said, doesn't come from Washington. We must demand that it happens. If I'm your president, I will fight that battle from the White House every single day, because my community is suffering, like communities across this country. But I need you in the streets also fighting as well. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go to my right here to the young lady, to the woman with the glasses. Excuse me.
I can be a young lady.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the environment? We have a lot of Superfund sites around the country, and there's a handful that are being chosen for public-private partnerships for cleanup, where it benefits the developer versus necessarily the residents. One of these is in my backyard, Mohawk Tannery in Nashua.
Right.
Are you paying attention to this? There's so many environmental rollbacks happening.
Right.
And I'm really concerned we're at the point where for 20 years we have not been able to do anything, and suddenly, because Scott Pruitt came through Nashua last year, everything's happening like this, and they're getting ready to start building.
So you hit a real big pain point for me personally, because I live in a community with Superfund sites all around me. And I really hope somebody asks me about climate, because I want to talk to you about what I believe we need to do in a visionary way. but I have been banging the drum since I was a city councilman that this nation must deal with justice issues, economic justice, criminal justice, and dear God, environmental justice. We have sites all around this country that are profoundly toxic, and we used to have a way to fund the cleanup. We had a bill that Reagan reauthorized, that Mitch McConnell actually voted on. There was a small tax on the most polluting companies in our country, very small tax, to create revenue to clean these sites up. And for a while, we were cleaning up Superfund sites. But what's happened is, in the time of no new taxes, no matter what they are, they didn't reauthorize that tax. I've tried time and time again as a United States Senator to get it voted on and reauthorize it, but we haven't done it. And now Superfunds are going up again in this country. But now you said this has been going on for decades. Well, now we have longitudinal data. Princeton had a report about children being born around Superfund sites. Not only these become often cancer clusters, but they have higher rates of autism, significantly higher rates of birth defects. And for a guy that my niece was born right around one of these toxic Agent Orange sites right there in Newark, it's unacceptable. The environmental justice issues in our country should be nagging at the conscience of every American. And I've gone from Duplin County, North Carolina, to Uniontown, Alabama, to a place in America that you can literally Google it. You don't need to know the state. Just put in Cancer Alley. It's a strip of the Mississippi River with all of these chemical polluting companies between Baton Rouge and Louisiana. In every area in our country, every state has these sites, and where is the moral urgency to clean them up? And they're usually in places with vulnerable populations and low-income families. But I tell you, in communities like this and others, this is a common American problem. So I put in a comprehensive environmental justice bill to do everything from giving people standing to sue on these issues, as well as to try to stop these sites often being put into communities, these toxic dumps, without the community having a say, and to identify streams of revenue to clean them up. And anybody who doesn't understand the moral urgency, understand the economic urgency. When you see what's happening to our children who live around the site, or elderly folks, or these cancer clusters, so much more to our economy to not let these things. And if you don't choose, because kids that go to school with elevated blood levels, kids that go to school with asthma rates, all the kind of health issues that come from living around toxic sites with toxic air, toxic water, they affect the success of that child in school. All of these issues are interrelated, and what we need to awaken again is that sense of moral urgency and economic prudence to deal with them. And if I am President of the United States, as a guy who comes from a low-income area, surrounded by toxic soil and polluted air, I will fight every single day to make sure we address them. Okay? I'm going to come back here to this gentleman here. Yes, sir. Well, I love your pin, sir.
Thank you.
His pin says, "I am a clean energy voter."
I'd like to build off what we just started on here, and it's an issue we can't afford to ignore. It's not a stationary issue. It is climate change. It will affect social justice. It will affect public health, and just about any other issue you can mention here today. I'd like to know how you're going to address that.
So he's asked about climate change for people that can't hear me, couldn't hear him. And this is something that we have to start dealing with an urgency. Our planet is in peril. There's a consensus of climate scientists that understand around the planet Earth and understand that the issue is accelerating and getting worse. If the temperatures continue to rise in our planet, we are going to see cataclysmic impacts on vulnerable people, causing water shortages, causing the kind of instabilities that often leads to famines and to wars. We're going to see crazy weather events increasing, from the horrific fires in the West to the terrible flooding in the Midwest. We must act with a sense of urgency in this country. And don't let anybody tell you that the issues of doing right by climate somehow have to hurt your economy. Quite the contrary. Doing the right thing by climate can actually help to invigorate your economy. How do I know that, Jim? I know that because I was a mayor. And I showed people in my city that doing the right thing can create win-win-win-wins. For example, we retrofitted all of our buildings environmentally. We lowered taxpayer costs. We created more jobs, apprenticeship programs for our kids. We created a better environment for our communities. Win-win-win-win. We in America need to lead the planet Earth in solving problems, not pulling out of international agreements and burying our head in the sand, hoping the problems will go away. I believe America is called to lead humanity, not follow it. We produce 14% of the carbon gas, of the global warming gases on the planet Earth. If we don't lead in new energies and new technologies, in the businesses and innovations of the future, if we don't lead in a world where we need the partnerships of our allies, if we don't lead now, we not only shun our moral duty, we actually imperil this planet. If I'm President of the United States, America will lead again. And it won't lead with words. It will lead by showing that we are going to invigorate this economy. We are going to transform the reality of our carbon causes gases, and we are going to make sure we rejoin with our allies and others to make sure that humanity is saved and that our children have a better planet to live on than we do. All right? I'm going to go over here to that gentleman right next to you next. So let's see if we can get both of you in.
Oh, me?
Yes, you.
Okay, so the, students have to, take out a ton of loans to go to college. And the student debt crisis is a huge issue. As well as New Hampshire has the highest rate of schooling in all of the states that we have here in the United States. So if you were elected, what would you do about that crisis and being able to make school a lot more affordable?
So she's asking about the cost of college and the crushing levels of student debt. My very first event here in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth, was with a woman who raised her hand and said that she's paying 15% interest on her loans. Why? Because you can't refinance, you can't lower your debt. You can refinance your credit card debt and everything, but there are people stuck paying 6, 7, 8%. I had never heard 15% before, but that's unconscionable. And people need to understand that right now, the federal government is making profit off of the backs of our students. This is how outrageous it is that we make billions of dollars in profits running our student loan programs, and meanwhile we have all these other areas where we're giving some of the wealthiest in our country tax breaks that many of them tell me they don't need. People who are 25-year-old people working in a hedge fund paying less in taxes, getting tax breaks, while students struggling to go to college so they can be nurses and teachers and child care workers, are carrying so much debt that they begin to question what their life calling is. We've got to change this system dramatically. And we've also got to change it because we're competing with other countries in the globe. In Germany, the cost of college is between 0 and 4%. In Canada, Trudeau, the cost of college is about 7% of median income. Here in the United States, over 52% of median income. And so we're going to take on the student debt problem. If I should be elected president, we're going to drive down debt. We're going to have debt forgiveness programs far more robust, especially for people who are going into professions like public schools, public teaching. We're going to explore doing bolder ideas like my baby bonds bill, which says that every child born in America gets a savings account. And depending on the income of your family, you get deposits in that savings account. Lowest income earners can get to be 18 with $50,000. Up to $50,000 to put into going to college, getting training, starting a job, or starting a business. We need to start having bold ideas that are going to make us internationally competitive and not crush families who are struggling with that. And I'm going to say one last thing. As we pump more money into colleges and universities through our Pell Grant system and more, we can't allow colleges to willy-nilly continue to raise tuition again and again and again with no accountability. We need to make sure we're providing all these new avenues to afford college. We've got to make sure that colleges are being held accountable for the cost of their tuition. And then the final thing we should say, every kid doesn't need to go to college. We put a stigma on the over 60% of Americans that don't have a college degree. There are so many other pathways to career success, and we need to honor those pathways and invest in them as well. Our competitors are investing in trade and apprenticeship programs. We should be leading the humanity in creating those trades and those apprenticeship programs where you can learn and earn at the same time and be ready for the jobs of the 21st century that don't always need the degrees that I have, sociology and history, where my dad used to tell me the only thing I'm really qualified to do is be a United States Senator. All right, the question of the gentleman behind him.
First, a personal statement. Thank you very much for coming. Like you, I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in Oakland, California.
Right.
Just as a personal note, I cried when I couldn't get into Stanford.
You sure the tribe being an All-American football player, sir? I got into Stanford because we were 4.0, 1,600, 4.0 yards per carry, 1,600 receiving yards. It's a very good way.
I went to college in a little small town in Louisiana, so I left California and went to Louisiana.
What college?
Northwestern State,
All
right
right.
outside of Natchitoches, Louisiana, right outside of Shreveport.
All right.
I used to be a corporate trainer, and I would challenge people if they could spell Natchitoches, I'd give them $10.
Well, my granddaddy's from Monroe, so I know the area. Yes.
So, then I went to law school, and I do a lot in the inner city in Massachusetts. I'm a partner of a little small law firm, and we do things in the inner city. I bring this up because I just had a situation where I fought for the freedom of a gentleman, and it was really, really hard to try to get him to be free. We finally secured his freedom. 2 hours later, he died. And he died of it is suspected of a heroin overdose. And I'm curious because that is rampant now. Growing up in the inner city, you see it. I know I see it in the inner city I grew up in. I see it now here in Nashua and other places. No disrespect to the mayor. How do you handle this epidemic if elected?
I'm really grateful for that question, and it really speaks to this issue of common pain, common purpose. So I see it. I live right across the street from me is this incredible nonprofit called Integrity House that helps people transition from addiction to recovery. And I sit often with the guys who are in circles, recovery circles, and see how we've treated their addiction. How do we treat their addiction? Jail, 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 jail. And often they don't get the treatment they need. It's one of the most expensive ways to deal with the system, but not actually deal with the problem that is causing the issues in the first place. And so we have a nation that is much more comfortable, it seems, much more adjusted to paying for issues on the back end when they're far more expensive, as opposed to doing the kind of interventions on the front end that are less expensive, more morally just, and actually solve the problems. If you look at our prisons and jails, and you know this from the work that you do, you can tell a lot about a society by who they imprison, who they incarcerate. In Russia, Putin puts his political opposition in prison. In Turkey, they literally have people who are incarcerated for the charge of fake news. We may now hear from the highest office in the land that the media is the enemy of the people, but we don't lock up our media, which is some folks here are breathing a sigh of relief. The young lady holding the NPR microphone is like, thank you, God, Corey. But here in America, go to our prisons and jails, and you see the shame of our country. That we overwhelmingly incarcerate the mentally ill, we overwhelmingly incarcerate the addicted, we overwhelmingly incarcerate the poor, we overwhelmingly incarcerate survivors of sexual trauma. 86% of the women we incarcerate are survivors of sexual trauma, and we overwhelmingly incarcerate black and brown people. You and I know this reality, as probably most people in this room, that when I was at college, in a place like Stanford, there are people using drugs, buying drugs from other friends. There's no difference in America between blacks and whites for using drugs or selling drugs, but African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for it. There's no stop and frisking at the way home from a frat party at Stanford. We have a different justice system treating different problems, the same problem in different ways depending on where you live. And so this is an urgency for me that we need to readjust our system. And right here in New Hampshire, people understand that. You talked about the mayor. I was just talking to the mayor about this issue. I was talking to some medical students here this morning about this issue, that New Hampshire, what you're seeing with mental health challenges, that you all are dealing with that in jails. You're dealing with these overcrowding of your hospitals and not having a real agenda. The federal government has a responsibility, and if I have my way, we're going to create a system that is both moral and economically prudent by creating more revenue and more investment in mental health care, in drug treatment, and the kind of things that end the shame of American prison system. Okay? All right. So this is what I want to assert. I want to assert my, my staff comes in, last question, Corey. And I'm like, no way, I'm the boss of me. We're going to do 2 more. We're going to do 2 more questions. This young lady here, and then I got to go to the young lady who housed me last night, our great representative back. So we're going to go, Representative, we'll go with you first, and then we're going to go with the young lady. Then I'm not running away. I will stay right here, answer more questions, take more selfies if you would like. Go ahead, please.
we are so focused on disease, AIDS, right?
I will repeat the question. I will repeat the question. I think she started off by saying she loved. No, but go ahead.
Yes. You know, I love your attitude, your hopeful attitude, positive attitude. But what we are looking at is the mental health, not just mental health and well-being. We need to shift, turn the tide or shift from crisis to early intervention, prevention, building resiliency. What's your plan for that?
Okay, so we don't have a healthcare system. We have a system that often is about disease treatment, about dealing with issues, again, on the back end of the problem, and not doing wellness, early intervention, and resiliency. It is outrageous what we do. And as a result of a system that's so broken, guess what? America leads the planet Earth in industrialized nations for infant mortality, for maternal mortality. We have things that are so expensive to deal with because we deal often with these things in hospital emergency rooms or after things have become acute. It is so much less expensive to deal with issues on the front end of the problem, to create a system that does intervention, that does wellness, and that does resiliency. And we need to start creating a system that creates the right incentives to do that, as opposed to what we see happening to doctors now, where they're being crushed by the requirements of their insurance company to race people through. We were talking about this earlier, that doctors often, when you come in presenting a problem, if you don't take time to talk with that person, you don't often see the issues going on behind that are causing that problem. So we have a system that is not built to build resiliency and intervention and prevention, and we've got to get back to that. I just want to harp on this before I go to this last question even more. The mayor and I were talking earlier today about the cost of keeping mentally ill Americans on the streets. That it costs more to a society if you were just being fiscally prudent, not answering the call of our commitments as Americans to one another, to have a more courageous empathy, that interdependency I talked about. But if you were just saying, I just am a fiscal conservative, which, hey, I respect you, because I think progressives are very fiscally prudent. And so here you have a study that was done, I was telling the mayor about this, in Washington, Seattle, where they studied the cost of 23 Americans with mental illness on streets, and then took the same 23, put them in supportive housing, and looked at the cost, which supportive housing is expensive, but we don't provide the streams to build it the way we should. And what they found out was it cost taxpayers $1 million more in that year when they were on the streets compared to supportive housing. Why? Where do mentally ill Americans often end up if they're left on the streets? Emergency rooms and jails. And so enough of this. We all know who are dealing with early interventions. It's so much cheaper to deal with problems. You know, nurse-family partnerships. So some people don't know what I'm talking about, but an at-risk pregnancy who has a nurse come up every month or two from the second trimester until the second year, the taxpayer expenses go down for every dollar invested about $5. And the wellness of that child and that mother even go way up. Early intervention. Why do we need to start our education system in America in kindergarten? Oh, we are so good. K through 12 education. Well, what are our competitors doing? Saying, no. We're going to start educating literally when children are born, because that's when the brain development is happening. Other countries have paid family leave. That is not some way to give some gift to parents. No, it's necessary to raising great kids. In my neighborhood, I see it. Natasha Laurel, one of my dear friends, I wrote about her in a book, works for IHOP. When her son was across the street in a hospital, gasping for breath with an asthma attack, she literally had to think to herself, what's more important right now? Staying here at work and getting this paycheck I need to keep the rent and food on the table, or giving up this paycheck and going there to be with my child? That's insane. That's why we need universal preschool in this country. Because we know that kids, if there's a kindergarten teacher here, you know it, our children are showing up to learn, not prepared or already behind. We need to start getting smart in America by making the investments on the front end and stop wasting human potential. Stop wasting money on the back end of problems. You have the last question.
Oh, boy.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. All right. Well, before you go, I just wanted to thank you so much. Again, everything you said is so inspirational. And
what's your name, by the way?
I'm Lily, and I go to Hollis Brookline High School.
Okay.
So it's just a town over.
All right.
Yeah, everything you said has been great, so inspirational. I'm aspiring to be a lawyer myself, so you're...
Beware.
I've heard, my parents have told me, but you're a huge inspiration. But I'll get to my question, because I know you have to go. With New York's new law on abortion, there's been a lot of talk, or a lot of harsh reactions across the country, and a lot of talk about repealing Roe versus Wade. So I'm wondering, as a young woman myself, how you're planning to actively and effectively preserve women's rights, women's reproductive rights.
I believe in a woman's right to make her own medical decisions, and that no government official should put themselves between a woman and her doctor. I believe in preventative care and access to family planning. I believe it is far cheaper for America to have thriving Planned Parenthoods in America, where often in many counties they're the only provider of family care services. I believe that we should be a nation that is valuing a woman's ability to make not only her own choices, but to empower her to have critical care. I believe we should stop demonizing women for making those choices, which are often painful and difficult. And we should not lie, like we've seen exaggerations about what's going on in states like New York. And so I will fight to protect a woman's right to choose, to Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court who will not roll back Roe v. Wade and protect the law and respect the law of this land. And that brings me to my how do we do those things? Is it enough just to elect a president to make sure we do those things? No. We need to have state legislatures, because state legislatures are important because they're drawing the district lines of the future. And right now we have a country where people are gerrymandering, which is an anti-democratic thing. We need to have local leaders that are cleaning up one of the biggest ills in our country, which is the money in politics. It's why I'm not taking corporate PAC money, I'm not taking federal lobbyist money, I'm not taking pharma executive money, because all of these things are undermining our democracy, and you cannot campaign wrong and govern right. But all of these things are going to be dependent upon our activism and our engagement, and I want to end with that. All of us have to decide. People want to make fun of that word. Oh, here we go, talking about hope again. But let me tell you how I define hope. And I've seen it here in New Hampshire. I live in Newark, New Jersey, and some of my greatest professors of my life, I got my PhD on the streets of Newark, learning from these incredible heroes, whose son was murdered in the lobby of the building I would move into when I lived in those projects. And he was murdered in the 1980s, and I couldn't believe why Miss Jones would stay in those buildings. Why would she choose, after her son was murdered by gun violence in the lobby of that building, why she wouldn't leave when I knew where she worked, I knew the money she made, she could have lived in a lot of different places. And she says to me, this tough woman, 5 feet and a smidgen tall, who scared me more than USC linebackers. And I said to her, why do you still stay here? And she goes, why am I still in Brick Towers? I go, yes, Miss Jones. She goes, why am I still in apartment 5A? That's what I asked, Miss Jones. She goes, why am I still the tenant president since these buildings were built in the 1960s? And I go, that is electoral longevity, no term limits here. Yes, why, Miss Jones? And she says to me, because I'm in charge of Homeland Security. Here's another American who said, I can't protect every American, but I can protect the ones on my block and on my neighborhood. She taught me that hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. Don't tell me about hope in this Pollyannish view that things are going to get better, it's going to get better. No, you cannot have great hope without great despair. It's always understanding that no matter what, we have a choice to meet darkness with light, to meet hate with love, to meet despair with being agents of hope. And I want to confess to you all something. The siren call of cynicism, the siren call of despair is strong right now in America. And you can see it's justifiable for people to be cynical about a system that just doesn't seem to work anymore, but we have to resist that siren call. I want to confess to you that call to despair has affected me some days. One of the most difficult days for me was on a January day in 2017 where I had to attend a presidential inauguration. And I stood up there worried and anxious, and a part of me just really believed maybe he's going to get up there and say something healing. Maybe he's going to say something like malice towards none and charity towards all, but all I ended up hearing was a whole lot of malice and very little charity. It was such a bad speech. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat. Heck, George Bush is reported to have said to turn to Bill Clinton as they're walking out, and George Bush is said to have said to Bill Clinton, That was some strange shit. I went home that night, and my mind is working. I'm a former mayor. I started counting votes on my council. I started looking at things. They had the control of the Senate. They had the control of the House. They had the White House now. And I'm believing now what they said, that they're going to roll back environmental protections on environmental justice issues. I'm believing what they said, that the protections from the Department of Education for LGBTQ youth were going to be under threat. I started believing what they said, that the Department of Justice was going to unleash the specter of mass incarceration and doubling down on it. I was worried about health care, that they said they were going to end the Affordable Care Act, and I crawled into my bed that night with a throbbing headache, curled up in the fetal position, starting to feel the call to despair. But the next morning, a whole bunch of Miss Virginia Joneses, millions of women from coast to coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, came out, and almost as if they were saying to me, Corey, weeping may endure through the night, but joy is going to come in the morning. It was almost as if they said to me, Corey, it is not time to curl up, to shut up, to give up. This is the United States of America. We never give up on each other. We never give up on love. We have seen demagoguery before. We have seen hate before. It has never defined us. What defines us is our ability to get up, to stand up, to speak up, to rise up. And if we keep with that conviction, if we stay with that strength of spirit, if we resist the seduction to hate, if we resist the seduction to fight fire with fire, if we resist the seduction to fall into apathy and indifference in the face of the suffering and injustice, and if we instead meet that with who we are, the people of impossible dreams and impossible accomplishments, I know that we are going to make for days tomorrow that show